like to go over how hip hop, rap, and poetry aid in shaping fashion design. And so before we start, I'd like to present a question. Everybody in the room, look at your shirt. What does it mean? Let's begin. So within contemporary society, I found that Instagram and TikTok in particular kind of serve as these spheres of influence and catalysts for portraying artistic messaging. And this aligns with one of the researchers I was looking at, Marco Padroni, and his study as a whole. And he states that content creators have aided in reshaping sort of the fashion industry as a whole, right? And so you see these content creators and they're providing news for individuals. Then that ties back to another researcher, Nina Torrero's study, where she looks at hip hop moguls Jay-Z and P. Diddy, right? And she looks at them and the lines that they started and how they tie back to the black community as a whole. So we're seeing a cultural tie back as in accordance to her. Then on top of that, when we're talking about fashion, it's important to acknowledge its environmental impact. And one of my other researchers, Mimi Maki, goes into how it's one of the most polluting sectors of any industry, really, and it causes for about 10% of global carbon emissions and 20% of water waste. And so when we consider all of these things in mind, I had a research question. How can poetry and lyricism in particular, through hip hop and rap, be integrated toward this sort of eco-friendly fashion design, right? And so that led me with a few goals, right? Firstly, I wanted to analyze how social media, Instagram and TikTok, which I'll later justify, how do they strengthen the connections between the culture, the art, and the messaging as a whole, right? And so I also wanted to look at how the audience is receiving these messages. What are they saying about the cultural tie-back? What are they saying about the art as a whole? What are they saying about fashion, right? And then I also wanted to go about determining the ability of eco-friendly fashion in serving as a message for this literary-based design, right? And so that led me to my hypothesis. I strongly believe that TikTok in particular, but also Instagram, are going to be amazing catalysts in delineating the eco-friendly messages that we wish to spread. And I think they're going to do this through hip hop and rap as a majority, right? I also believe that when we're tying this back to eco-friendly, like the eco-friendly subgenre of fashion, that it'll kind of invite a new demographic. And so that's what I had in mind when I was beginning to conduct this study. But before I did any of that, I had to identify a gap in the question. So I want to just go over like a little brief review of the three main sources that I'm referring to throughout the duration of this presentation. So firstly, Nini Maki, right? She goes into the sustainability in fashion, right? And as we saw previously, that's shown through the statistics. She does provide a multitude of other statistics in relation to fashion sustainability, but the important one is that it causes up to 10% of global carbon emissions and 20% of water use. Got to keep that in mind. Then Marco Padroni talks a little bit more about the marketing aspect. And so he was researching how social media sort of shaped the fashion industry from the year 2000 to 2020, right? And when I'm looking specifically for the contemporary side of fashion, I'm looking at, let's say, 2015 to 2020, right? That's what's relevant. And he states that Instagram in particular and TikTok were sort of these emerging catalysts in regards to fashion. Then Crane and Bourbon go and talk about the cultural identity in which fashion holds, right? And so how different cultures express themselves through different garments and how they can portray these different sorts of messages. But one thing that neither of these three studies went into is how the collaboration between literature in particular. And when I say literature throughout the remainder of the study, it refers to hip hop, rap, and poetry. That's what I'm referring to. And so I didn't see any studies talking about how literature could be integrated toward the eco-friendly fashion design on social media, Instagram, and TikTok. And so I had to figure out a methodology. There were three things that I relied on heavily during the study: trend analysis, sentiment analysis, and text mining. And I'm going to briefly go over those now. And so trend analysis is when we're looking at a group of data, whatever the data might be, and we're trying to find these common patterns, whether the patterns be positive or negative or in between, right? We're trying to observe these patterns and see their implications. Then sentiment analysis sort of ties back to how the people receive the clothes. And so commonly held sentiments, right? This kind of ties back into the themes of the art and what the community is saying as a whole, right? And then text mining, it sort of relates to the sentiment analysis, and it's kind of how I found these common sentiments in in the comments and the captions. Text mining was me going and looking for specific keywords throughout my study, which I'll touch on a little bit later right here. But I also had to determine what time period am I going to be looking at when I'm finding all this data. So I decided on 2018 to 2024, and that's justified through researcher Marco Pedroni, right? As seen here, from 2015 to 2020, on Instagram in particular, we saw that through fall fashion book, Instagram was responsible for the most engagement. And in his study, he also goes on to discuss how exactly TikTok in the year 2020 was beginning to sort of see this uprise in how they portray their messages and sort of ascertain engagement. And so that goes back to this, right? When I was collecting the data, I utilized text mining, and I was looking at posts that specifically mentioned lyrics, poetry, or artists, or the discography, or really any mention of eco-friendly fashion. So when I'm looking for all these things, I was sorting through specific keywords. If they didn't pertain to this, it was not included in my data set. That leads me to the quantitative data and the qualitative data. This was a mixed method sort of study. So for quantitative data, I was looking at the likes, the comments, and the shares. And for qualitative data, I was trying to find these common themes through the captions and the comments. And that leads to the results. So when I was conducting the study, I tried to obtain about maybe 50 videos. And there are two brief limitations that I have to discuss. One, there was a lack of eco-friendly content, and so that didn't really allow me to fully answer my hypothesis or research question, and it also prevented me from getting the desired amount of videos. But what we're going to want to focus on is the average here, right? And so we're going to observe that shares, it's about 9,400. And then for comments, it's about 2,500. And then for the likes in particular, the biggest category, people are always liking videos, they tap the screen. And so we see that there's about 157,000 on Instagram. And N means the number of. There's 24 videos on Instagram that I collected. Then for TikTok, I could only collect 19 videos. And this leads to my other limitation. A lot of these videos would have ended up being deleted by the time I tried to collect the data. And so I couldn't really reach for an equal amount. So when we're seeing this, I did account for how exactly I could keep the results proportionate, right? But that being said, shares weren't also really included on Instagram, whereas they were on TikTok. So this data isn't fully even, but I tried to account for all of those fallbacks. And so on TikTok, we see that there's about 106,000 likes, 593 comments, and 5,500 shares. So TikTok performed significantly less. Again, there were less videos I was looking at, but it performed significantly less in comparison to Instagram. And so I found a few key themes when I was looking at this, not only through my results, but through the videos that I was watching. And so there were some frequent artists that were commonly mentioned, right? Mainly Travis Scott, Tyler, the Creator, and Kendrick Lamar. These three all have a powerful tie back to not only African American culture, but hip hop culture and rap culture as a whole, right? And so here's one comment that says, "Oh my God, I want this Tyler, the Creator." But now what do they want? This shirt right here. And while it doesn't necessarily have any direct literary like tiebacks, it does have his face on the shirt and also the face of A$AP Rocky. And so when we're seeing this, we see that people, they care about the message that's being spread. They want people to see, hey, I like this artist. And so that's what was commonly generating a ton of user engagement. Furthermore, another assertion that's sort of justified through my data is Nina Torero. She states that fashion becomes a sort of form of communal language, right? And so people in the reply sections in particular were having discussions. Here's just one. Again, a collaboration between Converse and Tyler, the Creator. And somebody's like, these pair of shoes are not good. Somebody else is right here is like, if you style them well, they could be excellent, right? And so that kind of ties back into how this fashion in particular is being used and discussed within the community. Then another key theme that I noticed was the caption, how it told a story. And so I was observing that a lot of these posts were utilizing the lyrics or the poetry in the captions, right? But also, if they had a pinned comment, it might be there too. But I also noticed that this poetry and storytelling in particular tied back to the emotions of the viewers. So these posters knew their demographic pretty well, enough to know, hey, they're going to receive this well, and it worked. In the comments, people were tying this back to emotions, and they were expressing this via emojis or direct sentiment. And so I wanted to provide a caption that did this excellently, and it comes through Harlem-based designer Dapper Dan, right? And he states that his mission is not only to elevate the culture in reference to African American culture, hip hop and rap culture, but to dignify it as well. And so this is just one key example of how exactly these two things are validated. And then this isn't a key theme, but it's something that needs to be addressed: the performance and the platform influence. And so I was looking at Instagram and TikTok in particular, in accordance to Padroni's research, and I found that on TikTok there was really a higher amount of shares on like the videos. And now, while the data, the results that I found did not support that, more videos were receiving more shares, and this was made publicly accessible. So it is something that's heavily prioritized. And these videos that were shared quite often, they had voiceovers and lyrics, and so it was a very audio-based platform. And this aligns with Padroni's assertion again that performance-based content sort of resonates deeper with these audiences when we're discussing lyricism. So if we're seeing lyrical tieback, it's going to connect with the audience more than if you were just to see it over text or visuals. And on Instagram, I was noticing that you could have a post that just had an image, it didn't even have to be a video, and it could still succeed even more than, let's say, a video that contained a bunch of transitions and audio. And so this was namely or because of the captions, right? What were they putting in the captions? The reason the captions are so important is because on Instagram, hashtags are utilized heavily within their algorithm. And so that's also where my text mining ties back into. And this aligns with something that I found, that sentiment analysis in particular is really crucial for understanding how we can spread these messages of sustainability. While I didn't find many videos, I did see the interaction with viewers and the people watching, and this directly tied back into it. They were addressing all the sustainable concerns within the comments. So let's discuss. I found that poetry and lyricism are usually more effective when they're paired with these visuals or the performance as a whole, right? And so we saw this through reels, transition or overlays, or if it tied, like let's say you had a video and it had audio and the transition matched up or aligned with the audio, those posts were often shared more than posts that just contained simple text. Another thing that I noticed was the authenticity of creators mattered. So were they verified? Did they already talk about fashion or hip hop and rap and poetry? Or were they associated with a popular brand, right? These things mattered because people want credible news, right? And while this wasn't exactly the most important thing, I was seeing more engagement from these posters than I was from like underrated posters. And so lastly, it suggests a sort of opportunity for these underrated posters, because while they didn't perform as well most of the time, there were posters from designers or poets or just artists whose posts were succeeding tremendously in regard to these popular brands. And that's something I noticed, and it entails that these people can't succeed on these platforms. That leads me to some future research. So I believe that when we're talking about the eco-friendly regard, like I previously said, I couldn't find a lot of that within the videos. So I think that future research should begin to kind of prioritize this a little bit more. And one way in which they can do this is going to the websites of these brands or designers in particular and seeing what exact fabrics are used, what are the percentages that they're using. And that's how we can kind of tie this back to the eco-friendly side of my study. Then I also noticed that there was a lack of traditional poetry within all of this data. And so future researchers, instead of looking at hip hop and rap, because we already know those are prevalent and they're succeeding, they should solely look at poetry and solely determine how it's going to succeed, what marketing is needed for this poetry in order for it to perform well. Then I also believe that exploring these kind of demographic-based engagement trends are crucial, right? These creators have access to their demographics, and because of that, we can tie this back to the culture. I didn't have access to those demographics, but I think that future research should heavily prioritize that so we can kind of connect both the culture, the art, and the fashion and the sustainability. And so that leads me to some limitations and implications. The limitations of this study mainly were that not all posts had the full data metrics. So like I said previously, on Instagram especially, there was a lack of shares, and it was very prevalent. I can only find maybe about 7 videos out of the 24 that Then I also noticed that hip hop and rap were very prevalent amongst this data, and that kind of prevented me from talking as much as I would like to about the poetry and how it integrates toward fashion. And I also observed a lack of eco-conscious data, as I said previously. Very few of these videos that succeeded well, or the ones that I could find with the text mining in regard, they didn't really talk about eco-conscious data, so I kind of had to exclude that from my study, something that should be discussed a little bit more. Then the implications of my study can be observed through literature, right, as a whole. And literature is shown to kind of strengthen and empower the culture as a whole, right? We're seeing these lyrics and we're seeing these pieces of poetry, whether it be a stanza or a poem in its entirety, that the comments were receiving very well, and they often tied it back to culture. They were talking about their culture and the culture of art and music as a whole. And I also noticed that these small creators oftentimes outperform the big brands. And so that suggests that it's not all black and white, and that anybody can succeed if they have this understanding of the algorithm, which my study kind of highlights, and it kind of provides more insight into how these algorithms work. And then I noticed that when we're pairing visual and lyrical content together on both Instagram and TikTok, they tend to do tremendously well in comparison to something that might just be text. And we see a higher consumer impact and more demand. And so in conclusion, I note that hip hop lyricism in particular, when it's integrated toward fashion on social media, it thrives heavily in comparison to just text or poetry, or even just the lyrics as a whole. You need the audio to succeed on both platforms. And I also noted that fashion and literature can serve as cultural mediums, and that was proven through people such as Dapper Dan, Tyler the Creator, Kendrick Lamar, etc. All these people were tying the fashion and the literature back toward culture. And for future direction, I think the most crucial thing in answering this question is not only tying it back to poetry and hip hop, but making sure that we can see this collaboration with all of the eco-friendly brands and ultimately answering the research question. And this is my work site. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. We've got some world events questions for you. Panelist number 1.
How did your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation lead to your final research question project?
So when I had first started this class, I was already interested in all three of these things, but when I was looking toward the data as a whole, I was sort of noticing that a lot of these people did not talk about how these three connect. And I could see that there was an easy connection because I'm seeing it in my everyday life. The shirt that I'm wearing right now directly ties back into hip hop. And so I found that if we were to kind of pursue how these three connect, we would be able to kind of create a solution for all the eco-friendly impacting which fashion causes directly.
Thank you. Panelist number 2.
What are the real-world implications or consequences related to your findings?
So hip hop and rap, as it stands today, are some of the biggest genres as a whole, and something that I've commonly observed is that wherever I go, people will have these shirts with the faces of artists on them. But a lot of the times, as I've asked in the beginning of this presentation what the shirt means, we can't really decode the meaning of the shirts or the language as a whole. And so when I'm implementing the qualitative analysis in particular, it kind of aids in seeing how culture is decoded and how it's implemented toward these designs as a whole.
Thank you. Last question. If you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
If I could revisit the entirety of the research process, I would go and look at the websites in particular. As I mentioned for the future research, people should go and look at the websites and the percentages of fabrics used and what fabrics are being used, so we can kind of see how companies are already doing things and then create a solution. I didn't have the time to do that. There were numerous constraints throughout the entirety of this project, but it is something that I would like to do in the future and something that I wish I could have done during this project.
All right. Thank you, Sonny.